Grand Orient Freemasonry, Unmasked, Part 6. Chapter 16. The Intellectual and the War Party in Masonry. Eckert shows that at present all secret societies are divided into two parties, the party of direction and the party of action, or the war party. The duty of the intellectual party is to plot and to contrive. That of the party of action is to combine, recruit, excite to insurrection, and fight. The members of the war party are always members of the intellectual party, but not vice versa. The war party thus knows what is being plotted. But the other party, concealed as common Freemasons among the simpletons of the lodge, cover both sections from danger. If the war party succeed, the peace party go forward and seize upon the offices of state and the reins of power. Their men go to the hustings and make speeches that suit, are written up in the press, which, all the world over, is under Masonic influence. They are cried up by the adroit managers of mobs. They become the deputies, the ministers, the Talleyrans, the Fauchets, the Gambettas, the Ferries. And, of course, they make the war party generals, admirals, and officers of the army, the navy, and the police. If the war party fails, the intellectual party, who close their lodges during the combat, appear afterwards as partisans, if possible, of the conquering party, or if they cannot be that, they silently conspire. They manage to get some friends into power. They agitate. They, in either case, come to the assistance of the defeated war party. They extenuate the faults, while condemning the heedless rashness of ill-advised, good-natured, though too ardent, young men. They cry for mercy. They move the popular compassion. In time, they free the culprits, and thus prepare for new commotions. All Freemasonry has been long thus adapted to enable the intellectual party to assist the war party in distress. It must be remembered that every Campanaro is in reality a Freemason. He is taught the passes and can manipulate the members of the craft. Now, at the very threshold of the admission of a member to Freemasonry, the master of the lodge, the venerable, thus solemnly addresses him. "Masons," says he, "are obliged to assist each other by every means, when occasion offers. Freemasons ought not to mix themselves up in conspiracies, but if you come to know that a Freemason is engaged in any enterprise of the kind, and has fallen a victim to his imprudence, you ought to have compassion upon his misfortune, and the Masonic bond makes it a duty for you to use all your influence and the influence of your friends in order to diminish the rigor of punishment in his favor." From this it will be seen, with that astute care Masonry prepares its dupes from the very beginning, to subserve the purpose of the universal revolution. Under plea of compassion for a brother in distress, albeit through his supposed imprudence, the Mason's duty is to make use not only of all his own influence, but also of the influence of his friends, to either deliver him altogether from the consequences of what is called his misfortune, or to diminish the rigor of his punishment. Masonry, even in its most innocent form, is a criminal association. It is criminal in its oaths, which are at best rash, and it is criminal in promising obedience to unknown commands coming from hidden superiors. It always, therefore, sympathizes with crime. It hates punishment of any repressive kind, and does what it can to destroy the death penalty, even for murder. In revolution, its common practice is to open gaols, to let felons free upon society. When it cannot do this, it raises on their behalf a mock sympathy. Hence we have Victor Hugo pleading with every government in Europe in favor of revolutionists. We have the French Republic liberating the communists, and there is a motion before the French Parliament to repeal the laws against the party of dynamite, the internationalists, whose aim is the destruction of every species of religion, law, order, and property, and the establishment of absolute socialism. With ourselves there is not a revolutionary movement created that we do not find at the same time an intellectual party apparently disconnected with it, often found condemning it, but in reality supporting it indirectly but zealously. The Odgers and others of the trades union, for instance, will murder and burn. But it is the Bradlaws and men theorizing in Parliament if they can, or on the platform if they cannot, who sustain that very party of action. They secretly sustain what in public they strongly reprobate, and if necessary disown and denounce. This is a point worthy of deep consideration, and shows more than anything else the ability and the astuteness with which the whole organization has been planned. Again, we must remember, and that while the heads of the party of action are well aware of the course being taken by the intellectual party, it does not follow that the intellectual party know the movements of the party of action, or even the individuals, at least so far as the rank and file are concerned. If, therefore, can happen in this country that Freemasons or others who are in communication only with the Supreme Council on the continent get instructions to pursue one line of conduct, and that the war party, for deep reasons, get instructions to oppose them, this serves, while preventing the possibility of exposure, to enable the work of the infidel propaganda to be better done. It is the deeply hidden chief and his council that concoct and direct all. They wield a power with which, as is well known, the diplomacy of every nation in the world must count. There are men either of this council, or in the first line of its service, whom it will never permit to be molested. Weishaupt, Nubius, Mazzini, Piccolo Tigre, DeWitt, Meisley, Garibaldi, Number One, Hartmann, may have been arrested, banished, etc., but they never found the prison that could contain them long, nor the country that would dare deliver them up for crime against law or even life. It is determined by the Supreme Directory that at any cost the men of their first lines shall not suffer, and from the beginning they have found means to enforce that determination against all the crowned heads of Europe. Now the man who succeeded to the chieftaincy of this formidable conspiracy when Nubius passed away was none other than Lord Palmerston. Chapter 17. Lord Palmerston. It is with difficulty that one can believe that Lord Palmerston knew the veritable secret of Freemasonry, and that for the greater part of his career he was the real master, the successor of Nubius, the grand patriarch of the Illuminati, and as such, ruler of all the secret societies in the world. As a statesman, the distinguished nobleman had dealings of a close character with Mazzini, Cavour, Napoleon III, Garibaldi, Kossuth, and other leading revolutionary spirits of Europe in his day. But it was never for a moment suspected that he went so far as to accept the supreme direction of the whole dark and complex machinery of organized atheism, or sacrifice the welfare of the great country he was supposed to serve so ably and so well, to designs of the terrible secret conclave whose acts and tendencies were so well known to him. But the mass of evidence collected by Father Deschamps and others to prove Lord Palmerston's complicity in the worst designs of atheism against Christianity and monarchy, not even excepting the monarchy of England, is so weighty, clear, and conclusive that it is impossible to refuse it credence. Father Deschamps brings forward in proof the testimony of Henry Misley, one of the foremost revolutionists of the period, when Palmerston reigned over the secret Islam of the sects, and other no less important testimonies. But I would wish, if time permitted, to give at length. But the whole history, unhappily, of Lord Palmerston proves them. In 1809, when but 23 years of age, we find him War Minister in the cabinet of the Duke of Portland. He remained in this office until 1828, during the successive administrations of Mr. Perceval, the Duke of Liverpool, Mr. Canning, Lord Goderic, and the Duke of Wellington. He left his party, the Conservatives, when the last-named Premier insisted upon accepting the resignation of Mr. Huskinson. In 1830, he accepted the position of Foreign Secretary in the Whig ministry of Earl Grey. Up to this period he must have been well informed in the policy of England. He saw Napoleon in the fullness of youth, and he saw his fall. He knew and approved of the measures taken after that event by the advisers of George IV for the conservation of legitimate interests in Europe, and for the preservation for the Pope of the Papal States. The balance of power, as formed by the Congress of Vienna, was considered by the wisest and most patriotic English statesmen the best safeguard for British interests and influence on the continent. While it existed, the multitude of small states in Italy and Germany could always be so manipulated by British diplomacy as effectively to prevent that complete isolation which England feels today so keenly, and which may prove so disastrous within a short period to her best interest. If this sound policy has been since changed, it is entirely owing to Palmerston, who appears, after leaving the ranks of the Tories, to have thrown himself absolutely into the hands of that liberalistic Freemasonry which, at that period, began to show its power in France and in Europe generally. On his accession to the Foreign Office in 1830, he found the cabinet freed from the influence of George IV and from conservative traditions, and he at once threw the whole weight of his energy, position, and influence to cause his government to side with the Masonic program for revolutionizing Europe. With his aid, the secretaries were able to disturb Spain, Portugal, Naples, the states of the Church, and the minor states of Italy. The cry for a constitutional government received his support in every state of Europe, great and small. The Pope's temporal authority and every Catholic interest were assailed. England, indeed, remained quiet. Her people were fascinated by that fact. Trade interest being served by the distractions of other states, and religious bigotry gratified at seeing the Pope and every Catholic country harassed, they all gave a willing, even a hearty support to the policy of Palmerston. They little know that it was dictated not by devotion to their interests, but in obedience to a hidden power, of which Palmerston had become the dupe and the tool, and which permitted them to glory in their own quiet, only to gain their assistance, and, on a future day, to compass with greater certainty their ruin. Freemasonry, as we have already seen, creates many figurehead Grand Masters, from the princes of reigning houses and the foremost statesmen of nations, to whom, however, it only shows a small part of its real secrets. Palmerston was an exception to this rule. He was admitted into the very recesses of the sect. He was made its monarch, and as such ruled with a real sway over its realms of darkness. By the confidence he was flattered, cajoled, and finally entangled beyond hope of extrication in the meshes of the sectaries. He was a noble without a hope of issue, or of near heir to his titles and estates. He therefore preferred the designs of atheistic conspiracy he governed to the interests of the country which employed him, and he sacrificed England to the projects of Masonry. As he advanced in years, he appears to have grown more infatuated with his work. In 1837, in or about the time when Nubius was carried off by poison, Mazzini, who most probably caused that chief to disappear, and who became the leader of the party of action, fixed his permanent abode in London. With him came also several councillors of the Grand Patriarch, and from that day forward the liberty of Palmerston to move England in any direction, except in the interest of the secret conspiracy, passed away forever. Immediately, plans were elaborated, destined to move the program of Weishaupt another step towards its ultimate completion. These were, by the aid of well-planned revolutions, to create one immense empire from the small German states, in the center of Europe, under the House of Brandenburg, next to weaken Austrian dominion, and then annihilate the temporal sovereignty of the Pope by the formation of a united kingdom of Italy under the provisional government of the House of Savoy, and, lastly, to form of the discontented Polish, Hungarian, and Slavonian populations an independent kingdom between Austria and Russia. After an interval during which these plans were hatched, Palmerston returned to office in 1846, and then the influence of England was seen at work. In the many revolutions which broke out in Europe within 18 months afterwards. If these partly failed, they eventuated at least in giving a Masonic ruler to France in the person of the Carbonaro, Louis Napoleon. With him Palmerston instantly joined the fortunes of England, and with him he plotted for the realization of his Masonic ideas to the very end of his career. Now here comes a most important event, proving beyond question the determination of Palmerston to sacrifice his country to the designs of the sect he ruled. The conservative feeling in England shrank from acknowledging Louis Napoleon or approving of his coup d'etat. The country began to grow afraid of revolutionists, crowned or uncrowned. This feeling was shared by the sovereign, by the cabinet, and by the Parliament, so far that Lord Derby was able to move a vote of censure on the government because of the foreign policy of Lord Palmerston. For Palmerston, confiding in the secret strength he yielded, which was not without its influence in England herself, threw every consideration of loyalty, duty, and honor overboard, and without consulting his queen or his colleagues, he sent, as Foreign Secretary, the recognition of England to Louis Napoleon. He committed England to the empire, and the other nations of Europe had to follow suit. On this point, Chambers' Encyclopedia, Palmerston, has the following notice. In December 1852, the public was startled at the news that Palmerston was no longer a member of the Russell cabinet. He had expressed his approbation of the coup d'etat of Louis Napoleon, and gave England's official acknowledgment of the perpetuation, without consulting either the Premier or the Queen, and as explanations were refused, Her Majesty exercised her constitutional right of dismissing her minister. Palmerston had also audaciously interpolated dispatches signed by the Queen. He acted, in fact, as he pleased. He had the agents of his dark realm in almost every Masonic lodge in England. The press at home and abroad, under Masonic influences, applauded his policy. The sect so acted that his measures were productive of immediate success. His manner, his bonhomie, his very vices fascinated the multitude. He won the confidence of the trading classes and held the conservatives at bay. Dismissed by the sovereign, he soon returned into power, her master, and from that day to the day of his death ruled England and the world in the interests of the atheistic revolution, of which he thought himself the master spirit. We shall see the truth of this when considering the political action of the sect he led. But first it will be necessary to glance at what the Church and Christianity generally had to suffer in his day. Chapter 18. The War of the Intellectual Party. During what may be called the reign of Palmerston, the war of the intellectual party against Christianity, intensified in the dark councils of the Alta Vendetta, became extenuated and general throughout Europe. It chiefly lay in the propagandism of immorality, luxury, and naturalism amongst all classes of society, and then in the spread of atheistic and revolutionary ideas. During the time of Palmerston's influence, not one iota of the advices of the Alta Vendita was permitted to be wasted. Wherever, therefore, it was possible to advance the program mapped out in the Permanent Instruction, in the letter of Piccolo Tigre, and in the advices of Vindex, that was done with effect. We see, therefore, France, Italy, Germany, Spain, America, and the rest of the world deluged with immoral novels, modest prints, pictures, and statues, and every legislature invited to legalize a system of prostitution under the pretense of expediency, which gave security to sinners and a kind of recognized status to degraded women. We find, wherever Masonry could effect it, these bad influences brought to bear upon the universities, the army, the navy, the training schools, the civil service, and upon the whole population. "Make corrupt hearts, and you will have no more Catholics," said Vindex, and faithfully and with effect the secret societies of Europe have followed that advice. Hence, in France under the Empire, Paris, bad enough before, became a very pandemonium of vice, and Italy, just in proportion to the conquests of the Revolution, became systematically corrupted on the very lines laid down in the Alta Vendita. Next, laws subversive of Christian morality were caused to be passed in every state, on, of course, the most plausible pretexts. These laws were first that of divorce, then the abolition of impediments to marriage, such as consanguinity, order, and relationship, union with a deceased wife's sister, etc. Well, the infidels knew that in proportion as nations fell away from the holy restraints of the Church, and as sanctity and inviolability of the marriage bond became weakened, the more atheism would enter into the human family. Moreover, the few constitutions of a public Christian nature, yet remaining in Christian states, were to be removed one after another in some skilfully devised, plausible plea. The Sabbath, which in the Old as well as in the New Dispensation proved so great an advantage to religion and to man, to nations as well as to individuals, was marked out for desecration. The leniency of the Church, which permitted certain necessary works on Sunday, was taken advantage of, and the day adroitly turned into one of common trading in all the great towns of Catholic continental Europe. The infidels, owing to a previous determination, arrived at, in the lodges, clamored for permission to open museums and places of public amusement on the days sacred to the services of religion, in order to distract the population from hearing Mass and worshipping God. Not that they cared for the unfortunate working man. If the Sabbath ceased tomorrow, he would be the slave on Sunday that they leave him to be during the rest of the week. The one day of rest would be torn from the laboring population, and their lot drawn nearer than before to that absolute slavery which always did exist and would exist again under every form of idolatry and infidelity. Pending the reduction of men to socialism, the secret conclave directing the whole mass of organized atheism has therefore taken that in order to withdraw the working man from attending a divine worship and hearing the Word of God. Theaters, cafes, pleasure gardens, drinking saloons, and others still worse means of popular enjoyment shall be made to exert the utmost influence on him upon that day. This sad influence is beginning to be felt amongst ourselves. Then, besides the suppression of state recognition to religion, chaplains to the army, the navy, the hospitals, the prisons, etc. were to be withdrawn on the plea of expense or of being unnecessary. Courts of justice and public assemblies were to be deprived of every Christian symbol. This was to be done on the plea of religion being too sacred to be permitted to enter into such places. In courts, in society, at dinners, etc., Christian habits, like that of grace, before meals, etc., or any social recognition of God's presence, were to be scouted as not in good taste. The company of ecclesiastics was to be shunned, and 100 other able means were advised to efface the Christian aspect of the nations until they presented an appearance more devoid of religion than that of the very pagans. But of all the attacks made by infidels during the reign of Palmerston, that upon primary, middle class, and superior education was the most marked, the most determined, and decidedly, when successful, the most disastrous. We must remember that from the commencement of the war of atheism on Christianity, under Voltaire and the encyclopedists, this means of doing mischief was the one most advocated by the chief leaders. They then accumulated immense sums to diffuse their own bad literature amongst every class. Under the Empire, the most disastrous blow struck by the archmason Talleyrand was the formation of a monopoly of education for infidelity in the foundation of the Paris University. But it was left for the atheistic plotters of this century to perfect the plan of wresting the education of every class and sex of the coming generations of men from out of the hands of the Church and the influence of Christianity. This plan was apparently elaborated as early as 1826 by intellectual Masonry. About that time appeared a dialogue between Quintex and Eugene Sue, in which, after the manner of the letter of Vindex to Nubius, the whole program of the now progressing education war was sketched out. In this, the hopes which Masonry had from Protestantism in countries where the population was mixed was clearly expressed. The jealousy of rival sects was to be excited, and when they could not agree, then the state was to be induced to do away with all kinds of religion just for peace sakes, and establish schools on a purely secular basis, entirely removed from clerical control, and handed over to lay teachers, whom in time atheism could find means to control most surely. But in purely Catholic countries, where such an argument as the differences of sects could not be adduced, then the cry was to be against clerical versus lay teaching. Religious teachers were to be banished by the strong hand, as at present in France, and afterwards it could be said that lay teachers were not competent or willing to give religious instruction, and so that, too, in time, could be made to disappear. One may here call to mind the fact that it was while Lord Palmerston directed Masonry as monarch and English policy as minister that an insidious attempt was made to introduce secularism into higher education in Ireland by Queen's colleges and into primary education by certain acts of the Board of National Education. The fidelity of the Irish episcopacy and the ever-vigilant watchfulness of the Holy See disconcerted both plans or neutralized them to a great extent. Attempts of a like kind are being made in England. There, by degrees, board schools with almost unlimited assistance from taxes have been first made legal and then encouraged most adroitly. The church schools have been systematically discouraged and have now reached the point of danger. This has been effected, first, by the Masonry of Palmerston in high places, and secondly, by the Masonry of England generally, not in actual league and knowingly with the dark direction I speak of, but unknowingly influenced by its well-devised cries for the spread of light, for the diffusion of education amongst the masses, for the banishment of religious discord, etc. It was, of course, never mentioned that all the advantages cried up could be obtained, together with still greater advantage of a Christian education, producing a future Christian population. It was sedulously kept out of sight that the people who could be certain to use board schools were those who never went themselves to any church, and who would never think of giving religious instruction of any kind to their children. Nothing can show the power of Freemasonry in a stronger light than the stupor it was able to cast over the men who make laws in both houses of the English Parliament, and who were thus hoodwinked into training up men fitted to take position, wealth, and bread itself from themselves and their children. To subject, in another generation, the moneyed classes of England to the lot that befell others blinded, moneyed people in France during the last century. In England, the Freemasons had, unfortunately, the dissenters as allies. Hatred for church schools caused the latter to make common cause with atheists against God. But the destruction of the Church of England, they do not hope for the destruction of the vigorous Catholic Church of the country, will never compensate even Socians for a spirit of instructed, a religion in England, a spirit which, in a generation, will be able and only too willing to attempt atheistic leveling of its own advantage, and certainly not for the benefit of wealthy dissenters, or dissenters having anything at all to lose. The same influences of atheism were potent, and for the same reasons, in all Australian legislatures. There the influence of continental Freemasonry is stronger than at home, and the conservative influence with neutralize atheistic movements of too democratic a nature in England and Scotland are weaker. Hence, in all Australian parliaments, acts are passed with but a feeble resistance from the church party, abolishing religious education of every kind, and making all the education of the country secular, compulsory, and free. That is, without religion enforced upon every class, and at the general expense of the state. Hence, after paying the taxation in full, the Catholic and the conscientious Christian of the Church of England have to sustain in all these colonies their own system of education, and this while paying for the other system and while bearing the additional burden of the competition of state schools, richly and completely endowed with every possible requisite and luxury out of general taxes. A final feature in the education war of atheism against the Church especially, and against Christianity of every kind, is the attempted higher education without religion of young girls. The expense with which they have induced every legislature to undertake for this purpose is amazing, and how the nations tolerate that expense is equally amazing. It is but carrying out to the letter the advice of Index: if we cannot suppress woman, let us corrupt her together with the Church. For this purpose, those infamous hotbeds of foul vice, lodges of adoption, lodges for women, and androgynes, lodges for libertine masons and women, were established by the Illuminati of France in the last century. For the same purpose, schools for the higher education of young girls are now devised. This we know by the open avowal of leading Masons. They were introduced into France, Belgium, Italy, and Germany for the purpose of withdrawing young girls of the middle and upper classes from the blessed, safe control of nuns in convents, and of leading them to positive atheism by infidel masters and infidel associates. This design of the lodges is succeeding in its mission of terrible mischief, but, thank God, not amongst the daughters of respectable Christians of any kind, who value the chastity, the honor, or the future happiness here and hereafter of that sex of their children, who need most care and delicacy in educating. In the extract from the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendetta, you have already seen how astutely the atheist compassed the corruption of youth in universities. It is since notorious that in all high schools over which they have been able to obtain influence, the students have been deprived of religion, taught to mock and hate it, allured to vicious courses, and have been placed under the professors without religion or morality. How can we be surprised if the universities of the continent have become hotbeds of vice, revolution, and atheism? Moreover, when Masonry governs, as in France, Italy, and Germany, the only way for youth to obtain a livelihood on entering upon life is by being affiliated to Masonry, and the only way to secure advancement is to be devoted to the principles, the intrigues, and the interests of the sect. The continuous efforts of Masonry, aided by an immoral and atheistic literature, by a corrupt public opinion, by a zealous propagandism of contempt for the Church, for her ministers and her ministrations, and by a sleepless, able directory devoted to the furtherance of every evil end, are enough in all reason to ruin Christianity if that were not divine. But, in addition to the intellectual efforts, Masonry has had from the beginning another powerful means of destroying the existing social and Christian order of the world in the interests of atheism. Chapter 19. A War Party under Palmerston. Father Deschamps, on the authority of Eckert and Misley, gives an interesting description of all that Freemasonry, under the direction of Lord Palmerston, attempted and effected after the failure of the revolutionary movements conducted by the Party of Action under Mazzini in 1848. These were fomented to a large extent by British diplomacy and Secret Service money manipulated by Lord Palmerston. Under his guidance and assistance, Mazzini had organized all his revolutionary sects. Young Italy, Young Poland, Young Europe, and the rest sprang as much from the one as from the other. But after years of close union, Mazzini, who was probably hated by Palmerston and dreaded as the murderer of Nubius, began to wane in influence. He and his party felt, of course, the inevitable effects of failure, and the leader subsided without, however, losing any of his utility for the sect. Napoleon III appears to have supplanted him in the esteem of Palmerston, and would, had he dared, have ceased to follow the Carbonari. Mazzini accordingly hated Napoleon III with a deadly hatred, with which he lived to be able to gratify signally when Palmerston was no more. As he was the principal means of raising Palmerston to the power of the Alta Vendetta, so, after Palmerston had passed away, he introduced another great statesman to the high conductors, if not into the high conduct itself, of the whole conspiracy, and caused a fatal blow to be given to France and to the dynasty of Napoleon. Meanwhile, from 1848 to the end of the life of Palmerston, the designs formed by the High Council of Secret Atheism were carried out with a perfection, a vigor, and a success never previously known in their history. Nothing was precipitated, yet everything marched rapidly to realization. The plan of Palmerston, or the plan of the deadly council which plotted under him, was to separate the two great conservative empires of Russia and Austria, while at the same time dealing a deadly blow at both. It was easy for Palmerston to make England see the utility of weakening Russia, which threatened her Indian possessions. France could be made to join in the fray by her ruler and the powerful Masonic influence at his command, hence the Russian campaign of 1852. But it was necessary for this war to keep Prussia and Austria quiet. Prussia was bribed by a promise to get, in time, the Empire of United Germany. Austria was frightened by the resolution of England and France to bring war to the Danube, and so form a projected kingdom in Poland and Hungary. The joint power of England, France, and Turkey could easily then, with the aid of the populations interested, form the new kingdom, and so effectually curb Russia and Austria. But it was of more importance for the designs of the sects upon the temporal power of the Pope, and upon Austria herself, to separate the empires. Palmerston succeeded with Austria, who withdrew from her alliance with Russia. The forces, therefore, of England and France were ordered from the Danube to the barren Crimea as payment for her neutrality. This bribe proved the ruin of Austrian influence. As soon as Russia was separated from her, and weakened beyond the power of assisting her, if she would, France, countenanced by England, dealt a deadly blow at Austrian rule in Italy, united Italy, and placed the temporal power of the Pope in the last stage of decay. On the other hand, Prussia was permitted to deal a blow soon after at Austria. This finished the prestige of the latter as the leading power in Germany, and confined her to her original territory with the loss of Venice, her remaining Italian province. After this war, Palmerston passed away, and Mazzini came, once more, into authority in the sect. He remembered his grudge against Napoleon, and at once used his influence in the high direction of Masonry to abandon France and assist Germany. And on the promise of Bismarck, a promise fulfilled by the May laws, that Germany should persecute the Church as it was persecuted in Italy, Masonry went over to Germany, and Masons urged on Napoleon to that insane expedition which ended in placing Germany as the arbiter of Europe, and France and the dynasty of Napoleon in ruins. If the authorities quoted, there is abundant proof that Masonry, just as it had assisted the French Revolution and Napoleon I, now assisted the Germans. It placed treason on the side of the French, and sold in fact the unfortunate country and her unscrupulous ruler. Mazzini forced Italy not to assist Napoleon, and was gratified to find before his death that the liar and traitor who, in the hope of getting assistance he did not get from Masonry, had dealt his last blow at the Vicar of Christ, and placed Rome and the remnant of the states of the Church in the hands of the King of Italy, had lost the throne and gained the enviable character of a coward and a fool. This is necessarily but a brief glance at the program which atheism has both planned and carried out since the rule of Palmerston commenced. Wherever it prevailed, the worst of persecution of the Church at once began to rage. In Sardinia, as soon as it obtained hold of the king and government, the designs of the French Revolution were at once carried out against religion. The state itself employed the horrible and impure contrivances of the Alta Vendetta for the corruption and demoralization of every class of the people. The floodgates of hell were opened. Education was at once made completely secular. Religious teachers were banished. The goods of the religious orders were confiscated. Their convents, their land, their very churches were sold, and they themselves were forced to starve on a miserable pension, while a succession of rigorously prohibited all recognition of the spiritual power of bishops was put to an end. The priesthood was systematically despised and degraded. The whole ministry of the Church was harassed in 100 vexatious ways. Taxes of a crushing character were levied on the administration of the sacraments, on masses, and on the slender incomes of the parish clergy. Matrimony was made secular, divorce legalized, the privileges of the clerical state abrogated. Worse than all, the leva, or conscription, was rigorously enforced. Candidates for the priesthood at this most trying season of their career were compelled to join the army for a number of years, and exposed to all the snares which the Alta Vendetta had astutely prepared to destroy their purity, and with it, of course, their vocations. Make vicious hearts, and you will have no more Catholics. Besides these measures made and provided by public authority, every favor of the Senate, its power of giving honors, patronage, and place, was constantly denied to Catholics. To get any situation of value in the army, navy, civil service, police, revenue, on the railways, in the telegraph offices, to be a physician to the smallest municipality, to be employed almost anywhere, it was necessary to be a Freemason or to have powerful Masonic influence. The press, the larger mercantile firms, important manufactories, depending as such institutions mostly do on state patronage and interest, were also in the hands of the sectaries. To Catholics was left the lot of slaves. If permitted to exist at all, it was as the hewers of wood and the drawers of water. The lands which those amongst them held, who did not forsake religion, were taxed to an unbearable extent. The condition of the faithful Catholic peasants became wretched from the load of fiscal burdens placed upon them. The triumph of atheism could not be more complete, so far as having all that the world could give on its side, and leaving to the Church scarcely more than covered her divine founder upon the cross. Bismarck, though assisted in his wars against France by the brave Catholic soldiers of the Rhine and of the fatherland generally, no sooner had his rival crushed and his victory secured than he hastened to pay to Freemasonry his promised persecution of the Church. The Freemasons in the German Parliament and the ministers of the sect aided him to prepare measures against the Catholic religion as drastic as those in operation in Italy, even worse in many respects. The religious orders of men and women were rigorously suppressed or banished as a first installment. Then fell Catholic education to make way for an infidel propagandism. Next came harassing decrees against the clergy by which bishops were banished or imprisoned and parishes were deprived in hundreds of their priests. All the bad, immoral influences, invented and propagated by the sectaries, were permitted to run riot in the land. A schism was attempted in the Church. Ecclesiastical education was corrupted in the very bud, and all but the existence of Catholics was proscribed. Wherever we find the dark sect triumphant, we find the same results. In the republics of South America, where Freemasonry holds the highest places, the condition of the Church is that of normal persecution and vexation of every kind. It has been so many years in Spain and Portugal, in Switzerland, and to whatever extent Freemasonries can accomplish it, in Belgium and in Austria. The Dark Directory succeeding Weishaupt, the Alta Vendetta, and Palmerston, sits in Paris and in Berlin almost openly, and prepares at leisure its measures, which are nothing short of, first, the speedy weakening of the Church, and then a bloody attempt at her extermination. If it goes on slower than it did during the French Revolution, it is in order to go on surer. Past experience, too, and the determinations of the sect already arrived at, show but too clearly that a single final consummation is kept steadily in view. The impure assassins who conduct the conspiracy have had no scruples to imbue their hands in the blood of Christians in the past, and they never will have a scruple to do so. Whenever there is hope of success, in fact, from what I have seen and studied on the continent, an attempt at this ultimate means of getting rid, at least, of the clergy and principal lay leaders among Catholics might take place in France, and even in Italy, at any moment. In France, some new measure of persecution is introduced every day. The Concordat is broken openly. The honor of the country is despised. Subventions, belonging by contract to the clergy, are withdrawn. The insolence of the atheistical government, relying on the strength of the army and on the unaccountable apathy or cowardice of the French Catholic laity, progresses so fast that no act of the Revolution of 1789 or of the Commune can be thought improbable within the present decade, and Italy would be sure to follow any example set by France in this or any other method of exterminating the Church. There are sure signs in all the countries where the atheistic revolution has made decided progress that this final catastrophe is planned already, and that its instruments are in course of preparation. These instruments are something the same as were devised by the illuminated lodges when the power of the French Revolution began to pass from the National Assembly to the clubs. The clubs were the open and ultimate expression of the destructive anti-Christianity of atheism, and when the lodges reached so far, there was no further need for secrecy. That which, in the jargon of the sect, is called the object of the labor of ages, was attained. Man was without God or faith, king or law. He had reached the level aimed at by the Commune, which is itself the ultimate end of all Masonry, and all that secret atheistic plotting which, since the rise of atheism, has filled the world. In our day, if Masonry does not found Jacobite or other clubs, it originates and cherishes movements fully as satanic and as dangerous. Communism, just like Cabanarism, is but a form of the illuminated Masonry of Weishaupt. Our end, says the Alta Vendita, is that of Voltaire in the French Revolution. Names and methods are varied, but that end is ever the same. The clubs of the period of the French Revolution were, after all, local. Masonry now endeavors to generalize their principles and their powers of destructive activity on a vastly more extended scale. We therefore no longer hear of Jacobins and Girondins, but we hear of movements destined to be for all countries what the Jacobins and the Girondins were for Paris and for France. As surely, and in the same purpose, as the clubs proceeded from the lodges in 1789, so, in the latter half of the 19th century, the lodges sent out upon the whole civilized world, for the very same intent, the terrible socialist organizations, all founded upon the lines of communism, and called according to the exigencies of time, place, and condition.